Okay. So hi, everybody. Welcome to the 35th episode, I put that on the slide there, of the SFU Sports Analytics Virtual Seminar Series. Today we have Dr. Caen, who's going to speak to us today about the critical power modern applications of a classical concept. Dr. Caen is a postdoctoral researcher in the Exercise Physiology Research Group of the Department of Movement and Sport Sciences at Ghent University in Belgium. He's developed broad expertise within the domain of exercise testing, with a specific focus on critical power model. Caen is also affiliated with the Center of Sports Medicine of the Ghent University Hospital for the physical screening of elite athletes, and he is assigned as a guest lecturer in sports physiology at the University of Verona in Italy. He's authored over 20 peer-reviewed scientific publications. Just on a personal note, so I've known Dr. Caen's work for several years now, and I find it to be some of the highest quality in this specific area of research. So I'm really excited to have him, that he's agreed to come and speak to us today. So in terms of what he's actually going to be discussing, so it's going to be a mix of exercise physiology and some modeling. Well, those of you who are more data sciencey will have to bear with us. He's going to discuss the critical power concept, which provides a mathematical and physiological framework to study exercise performance and fatigue development during high-intensity exercise. The model defines the hyperbolic relationship between power output, time to exhaustion by two parameters. First parameter, critical power itself, represents a metabolic rate that corresponds to the so-called maximal metabolic steady state intensity. So when you exercise above this intensity, you can expect to fatigue in a relatively rapid way. The second parameter, which is W prime, represents a finite amount of energy that can be spent above power. Two aspects of this model will be discussed. First, the equivalence of critical power with other measures of maximal metabolic steady state, so-called, which is like the maximal lactate steady state, respiratory compensation point, and muscle deoxygenation breakpoint. Excuse me. So these are three physiological measures of the steady state. Second, predictive models of the W prime dynamics have been proposed, but the predictive capabilities are questionable. Limitations and challenges associated with these models will be discussed. So with that, I'm going to stop screen share and hand it over to Tom. And again, thanks everybody for joining us, and I look forward to the talk.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. I share my screen. Does that work?
Yeah, it looks great to me.
Okay, perfect. Good morning, everyone. I should say good morning because here it's already evening. I'm happy to be invited to give this online seminar. You can see that the title is slightly different than what was on the previous slide, but no worries, the contents will be identical. I copied the title of my PhD I defended 2 years ago, Crossing the Threshold, New Insights on Exercise Thresholds and Acute Recovery from High-Intensity Exercise. And as you just heard, indeed, we will discuss these topics from the viewpoint of the critical power model, which features two parameters, critical power, which is an exercise threshold, and the W prime, which is interesting in the modeling of performance. I can skip my short biography because this has already been told. Just as a short introduction, so you guys know where I'm from, where I'm working. So I'm from Belgium. I work at the Ghent University. You can see our rowing track in this picture, and on the right side you can see our department building. So this is our main building, and just for your interest, I'm part of the exercise physiology group, but next to the exercise physiology group we also have research on biomechanics and motor control, physical activity and health, sports management, and sports pedagogy. Almost 6, even 7 years ago, we built, or the Ghent University built a new sports scientific lab where we can do our research, and mainly it's divided in two main parts, an exercise physiology lab, which you can see on the right, and also a biomechanics lab. So that's where I perform the research that I will present to you later in this talk. This is the team that I'm part of. So the team is led by two professors, Professor Jan Bohne and Professor Jan Bourgeat. So 5 years ago, we were only with 4 members. So over the years, we were able to expand our team, and our main research lines within our group are related to exercise testing, athlete profiling, performance modeling. So those are the main research topics that we are working on. So for today, I will present you some of the research I've done in the context of my PhD, so the past 6 years. But just to start, I think it's important to give you some introduction about the critical power model itself. I think most of you have heard of it. Some of you are maybe quite experienced with it, but just because I think it's important to get some history, some background on that concept before we move on to, or to dig deeper into the research that I've done on that model. I always use a very short timeline. Actually, if we talk about the critical power model, we can go back almost 100 years ago. And then there was a pioneer physiologist, Hill, later Nobel Prize winner. And what he did was he plotted world records at the time in different sports, in swimming, rowing, cycling. And he plotted the intensity of that specific record, that particular record, against the time, the endurance time of that record. And what he noticed for the first, as the first person, was actually a hyperbolic relationship between that intensity of the effort and the sustainable time. And I did it myself as well some months ago. And as you can see, 100 years later, that relationship is still standing. So that's what we call the power duration relationship, which is known as the critical power model. So for example, here, of course, it's not about power because I took some examples from running, but if you plot those in males, the blue dots, and in females, the purple dots, you can see that nice hyperbolic relationship, which is quite obvious, of course, because the higher the intensity you're exercising at, the shorter you can sustain that intensity. However, at the time, Hill did not use the word critical power or critical speed. Took almost 40 years because that term popped up in the literature, and that's the key publication by Monod and Scherer. I see that the date on top is not correct. It should be 1965. And there, these authors defined critical power. You can read a sentence out of the abstract. The critical power of a muscle or a muscle group corresponds to the maximum rate that it can keep up for a very long time without fatigue. At the time, these authors determined critical power in specific muscles or muscle groups. So they let subjects perform, for example, bicep exercise, and they found that at some specific particular work rate, it took a very long time until participants were exhausted. We move 20 years further. Took 20 years before the concept was translated to whole body exercise. So in 1965, Monod and Scherer did the experiments on muscle groups. And then in 1981, there was a publication by Moritani, and they found the power relationship exactly as we found across individuals with the world records. They found that within individuals. So if you let the subject come to the lab and let him or her perform constant load tests until exhaustion, you can see those dots on the graph, and you draw a regression line through that, you can see that nice hyperbolic relationship. So that's the background of what we today know as the critical power model. And you can see the formula in the middle. And when we talk about the critical power model, it's important, I think, that we make a distinction, or that we are aware of the distinction between the mathematical definition or the mathematical meaning of this concept and the physiological meaning of this concept. Mathematically, if we look to the graph, the critical power corresponds to the asymptote of the power duration relationship. So again, if we think back about the original definition that was given by Monod and Scherer, it's a metabolic rate is the maximum rate that we can keep up for a very long time without fatigue. So mathematically, it's the power output or the intensity that we could sustain indefinitely. And of course, you can already know that in practice, that's not possible. But so critical power mathematically, the asymptote of the relationship, and then the W prime mathematically corresponds to that blue box. So the area below between the curve and that asymptote. And again, important to realize is that the area of each of those boxes is exactly the same. So it's a fixed amount, and you can already see it. It's an energy reserve. It's a fixed amount of work, of energy that you can perform once you go above that critical power. So power duration relationship is defined by those two parameters: critical power, the metabolic rate, the asymptote, and that fixed box below the curve, the fixed energy reserve, which we call W prime. Of course, it's a mathematical model, so there are some model assumptions, related to this model if we translate it to physiology. And the four main assumptions are listed over there, and it's important to be aware of those assumptions. According to the critical power model, there are only two energy components, meaning the aerobic and the anaerobic components. And purely from a theoretical point of view, the critical power, or CP, I will call it from now on, CP relates to the aerobic energy turnover, and W prime to the anaerobic energy turnover. The aerobic energy supply, so the critical power, is unlimited in capacity, because indeed it's the asymptote. So the power output at critical power or below, you would, or you should be able to continue at that work rate forever, but it's limited in rate, as you can see. So once you go above that, you're relying on the anaerobic energy supply, and that's the opposite. It has the opposite characteristics. So it's limited in capacity. Remember that box that you can see, but it's unlimited in rate. Okay, and when the W prime is 0, when that energy box is 0, then you're exhausted and you should stop the exercise. How do you determine critical power W prime? There's a lot to talk, or a lot to say about the determination of critical power W prime as well, but I will not go into detail on this because it would bring us too far. But just for your interest, the classic method to determine critical power is that you need several tests, several constant load tests, or if you want to do it in practice, you can use time trials as well, of course. It's recommended to have at least 3, possibly 4 to 5 tests within a time range of 2 and 20 minutes, because we know within that time range, the critical power model works well for different reasons. But so actually, if you want to determine critical power, all you need is a bicycle or an ergometer in the lab and a stopwatch, and in practice it's actually the same. So to determine critical power, and that's also why I often call it a performance threshold. It's not that we measure something physiologically during those tests. It's just based on performance of different at different tests. So in that view, it's quite easy to determine. On the other hand, it's not always easy to get precise or accurate estimates of those parameters. And of course, also practically, it's quite time consuming to bring athletes to the lab to do those tests. And it's also physically demanding because all tests should be done until exhaustion. So they, you need a full effort of your athlete when you perform those tests. If we look at the critical power model from a physiological point of view, so I gave you the mathematical definition: asymptote, fixed area below the curve. Critical power, you should see it as a threshold concept. And the most easy definition is that it separates steady state exercise from non-steady state exercise. And to show you that, I can refer to the early publication of Poole and his colleagues, who show that when subjects cycle at critical power, they reach a steady state response in blood lactate and oxygen uptake, which are two parameters that give us a nice reflection of what happens metabolically in our body. While if those subjects were asked to cycle at 5% above that critical power, you can see that the responses in blood lactate and oxygen uptake are completely different. And in this example, the subject couldn't even sustain that exercise for 24 minutes. So you can see no steady state anymore. Blood lactate and VO2 rises and they reach their peak values. So the critical power, at least in theory, forms the boundary between steady state and non-steady state exercise. And as you could see on the previous slide, if we talk in terms of intensity domains, it's the boundary between what we call heavy intensity and severe exercise intensity. Some other data that supports that that meaning or that role. If you look at metabolites inside the muscle, so here you can see, for example, phosphocreatine on the left, inorganic phosphate groups in the middle, and the pH on the right. And again, it's the kind of the same story. The black dots are exercising below critical power, just below critical power, and the white dots are exercising above critical power. Below critical power, you don't see a lot happening in those parameters, but once you go above critical power, you start depleting your phosphocreatine, you get an accumulation of PI, and you get the acidosis as reflected by the drop in pH. So again, same story. If we look at the W prime, then one of the model assumptions was that we have two parameters, critical power W prime, and they represent respectively the aerobic and anaerobic energy supply. So initially it was thought that W prime reflects purely an anaerobic energy reserve. And if you look at the physiological determinants, then it's related to everything that has to do to glycolysis, the high energy phosphate, so the phosphocreatine that I showed you in the previous slides, and a small contribution of intramuscular oxygen stores. But we know today that W prime is very closely related to VO2 kinetics as well, and it's also very closely related to changes in critical power. For example, what we often see is that when you train athletes and you get a difference in, for example, critical power, you get an improvement in critical power. At the same time, it's very probable that you will get a drop or a decrease in your W prime, for example. So it's really the interplay between critical power and W prime that will determine the net performance of your athlete. So in that way, I think you should always see the critical power model not as just two separate parameters, but as one bioenergetic system as such. Something interesting, what we see if people exercise at a power output above their critical power, at the point of exhaustion, even when that power output is different or the duration of the exercise is different, it seems that within the muscle, people reach, let's say, a critical metabolic environment. So if you look at concentration of phosphocreatine and the pH level, at the end of two exercises at a different intensity, at the moment of exhaustion, what you measure is kind of exactly the same concentration or pH, and these figures show actually the same. If you look on the right graph, the three dots above severe, they show three different trials within the severe intensity domain. So it means above critical power. 3 times at a different power output. But if you look at all the things that were measured on the left graph, it seems that at the end of the exercise, it doesn't matter how high the power output was, because at the end, people stop when they reach kind of a critical limit inside the muscle. So when W prime is or equals 0, might be that we reach some critical metabolic milieu within the muscle. So that's kind of an interesting observation. Okay, if we want to apply critical power in sports, it's more easy to list up the sports that critical power is not applicable to. You can apply the concept to most sports in which the W prime gets challenged, and only sports in which you have few muscle contractions, archery, athletics as well, sports in which W prime is not really challenged because there's too much rest in between the exercises, baseball, American football, and also, of course, sports where you will never exceed an exercise intensity above critical power. For example, all ultra events such as ultra running, and of course, those are sports where you cannot apply that critical power. So in theory, you can apply the critical power model to a lot of sports. However, if we look at the original model, and then we go back to the formula, if you look at the formula, so the relation between the time to exhaustion and the power that you produce, or the speed that you run or swim, if you know the critical power and W prime, you can predict any time to exhaustion for a given power output, and also vice versa, you can predict any power output for a given time to exhaustion. However, of course, if we think in reality, there are very few sports disciplines in which there's one single and gradual depletion of your W prime. For example, if we take cycling, if we take road cycling, for example, it's not that those cyclists produce an equal power above their critical power the whole time. Here you can see an example of a power file. It's from a few years ago, I think 2019. It's a stage in the Giro from a Belgian cyclist. This is a mountain stage. You can see his power profile. I got it from Strava. And you can see a lot of variation, of course, in that power. And at some points, he's really cycling above his critical power. So he's using that W prime. At some points, he's, for example, downhill, he's even freewheeling. So he's far below his critical power. So that original formula of critical power does not allow us to predict any performance as such. So that's the reason that, and we're almost at the end of the timeline here, that researchers start to apply the critical power model to intermittent exercise. And Morton and Bilal were the first, and what they assumed is just a simple model, just like we assume that W prime depletion occurs in a linear way. They said, okay, W prime recovery occurs in a linear way as well. And they calculated that just by taking the difference every time between the power outputs that you cycle and the critical power, and they multiply that by the time, just to calculate how many joules, how many energy you lose during efforts above critical power, and how many joules of energy you recover during efforts or recovery below critical power. So it's a very simple model. There was a publication some years later that tried to model that W prime recovery. And what you can see on this graphs already, if people were asked to cycle until exhaustion and then they could recover some time, that the W prime did not seem to recover in a linear way as it was initially assumed. And actually this was, or this publications formed the basis or the basic idea for what is the most famous model of W prime recovery, the one published by Philip Skiba and his colleagues, the W balance model. And actually this is this was quite an innovative model. So WBAL stands for W balance, the balance and W prime, because this model was developed to calculate the balance, the dynamic balance in W prime at any time during exercise. And so if we look at the formula, actually the balance in W prime equals your initial W prime, so W prime of a specific athlete, minus the amount of W prime that is expended, so the EXP, expended during efforts above critical power. And as you can see, of that part of W prime that is expended, some part can be recovered. And the most important thing in this formula is that it's assumed that the recovery happens in an exponential way. So you can see the E over there. So it's not like Morton and Bilas suggested that recovery of W prime is linear. No, here the author said, no, W prime, based on the observations of Ferguson, recovers in an exponential way. And of course, if we talk about exponential functions, there's always a time constant. And based on experiments, lab experiments in recreative subjects, they distracted a formula for that time constant. So if you look at the formula of the time constant, you see a bunch of constants, but there's one, oh, I'm too quick here. There's one parameter that can change, and that's the DCP. The DCP is the difference between critical power and the power that you're cycling during recovery, which means the higher the DCP will be in this formula, the lower the time constant, and so the faster recovery. Again, that sounds really obvious because the lower we are below our critical power, if I cycle 200 watts below my critical power compared to only 100 watts, of course, I will be recovering faster. Okay, but so that's already an important thing here to remember, is that in this initial W balance model, it's assumed that the recovery of your W prime is dependent only on two parameters, being the duration of your recovery and the power output of the recovery. Okay, so that DCP, so the exponential recovery based on DCP. Of course, the practical implications of such model are quite big, and honestly, at the time, this model actually was kind of a new way to quantify fatigue and what you can call residual performance capacity, because it would allow you at any time during training or races, if you know someone's critical power and W prime, and you have access to live data of the power output that the rider produces. If you use a power meter, for example, you could track or monitor that state of W prime through training or races. And also, of course, it can be a useful tool if we think about the setting of interval training, because coaches often use their experience or their gut feeling when they make interval training programs. But if you have more insight into the dynamics of that W prime, you can further optimize that kind of interval training and further individualize that kind of training. So there are quite some interesting applications if those models would work or work properly. So here to right, you can see an example of a rider. Black lines are his power outputs. The dashed line, the horizontal line, is a critical power, and you can see the green line is his W prime, modeled by the W balance model. So obviously, when he goes above critical power, that green line drops. So he's starting to deplete his W prime, and as you can see, between minute 20 and 30, he's forced to reduce his power output a bit in order to be able to recover a bit of his W prime. And for example, the W balance model and also some other models at this time, there are some applications. You can download them, install them on your Garmin watch, for example. You can enter your critical power, your W prime, if you have a power meter, and you can get some insight into that W prime. So sounds interesting and promising. And as you can see, from the time that the critical power concept was applied to intermittent exercise, the concept has gained quite some popularity. If we look at the number of publications and citations in the past 10 to 20 years, there's quite some scientific interest, and also from sports practice. A lot of pro cycling teams nowadays use those critical power measurements and those W prime measurements to train their athletes and to use where possible during training and racing. Okay, let's move to the research. I told you before, I did research. I split it up in two parts. So part one, threshold interchangeability, and part two, modeling W prime recovery. Because what I did during my PhD is I put focus on both parameters separately, because of course, if you want to have an accurate modeling of W prime during exercise, you should also make sure that the determination of critical power and the validity of critical power that you use as that threshold is correct. And also the interchangeability of critical power with other thresholds, which are commonly used in practice, is quite a hot topic in scientific literature. So first part, I will focus on CP and on the interchangeability or the equivalence of CP with other commonly used thresholds in practice. And then the second part, I will focus more on the work I've done on the modeling of W prime recovery. So of the studies I've done, I picked only one. I picked out one. It's the latest one we did. So we're focusing, just to be clear, on that boundary between heavy and severe exercise. We call it the maximal metabolic steady state. And I showed you these graphs. Below that boundary, you have steady state responses. Above that boundary, that's not possible anymore. Now, next to critical power, there are also other threshold methods. And the most known, or another reference method, is, for example, the maximal lactate steady state. We also have the respiratory compensation point, and more at the local level, for example, at the working muscles, the vastus lateralis, we can also measure muscle oxygenation, muscle activation, and also in these responses during exercise, we can find or we can detect some thresholds. So critical power, I explained you. Maximal lactate steady state, definition of that threshold is it's the intensity, the highest intensity during which you can reach a steady state in blood lactate. So also the determination of this threshold requires the performance of different constant load tests, mostly 30-minute tests. You measure blood lactate and you search for the highest intensity for which that blood lactate remains stable. And next to critical power, that's often referred to as a criterion method or a reference method to determine that maximum metabolic steady state, that threshold. You can also measure gas exchange during an exercise test. And as you can see on that graph, at a certain point, you can see the onset of hyperventilation during the test. It's what we call the respiratory compensation point. You might know the threshold also as the second ventilatory threshold. Again, that's a threshold that's validated as that same maximal metabolic steady state threshold. And then those two local thresholds, if you put the probe on your upper leg during exercise, during an incremental exercise test, at a certain point, you can see in that same range of intensities a breakpoint. You can see it in the oxygenation response, but you can also see it in the activation response. So the activation of your muscles during such tests. Now, the debate in the literature is all those thresholds separately are presented to reflect the same threshold, the maximum metabolic steady state. But the question is, are they equivalent, or can you use them just interchangeably, or maybe the question is better, is it justified in practice and in research to use those thresholds interchangeably? And if you look at, I listed up some publications between 2000 2016. There's a lot of in consensus about their equivalence. Now, what we did is we wanted to perform a longitudinal study, because most of the research is cross-sectional in the literature, and also most of, as you could see on the table, I go back, most of the studies focus on few of those thresholds at once. So what we did is we included all those 5 thresholds in our study, and we make a longitudinal study. And we had 2 main questions. We wanted to look at the typical variation of thresholds. So it's interesting for research and practice. If you use thresholds, what's the typical variation you can expect just from day-to-day variation, methodological variation? And of course, the main question, can you use them interchangeably? We had 2 subject groups. We had a women group and we had a man group. And the women group, we determined, in that group, we determined thresholds before and after a 4-week period in which there was no intervention. So those females did not train, they just maintained their habitual sports. And the male group, we tested them before and after a 12-week period. And that period was because we had a COVID lockdown down. And during that period, participants increased their sports practice. You can see that there's kind of a training effect in that group. And so before and after the 4 and the 12-week period, we determined all thresholds again, so we could take a look at how those thresholds evolved over time and how if they were significantly different from each other. So as you can see, if you look at peak power output and VO2 peak from the incremental test, you can see in study, we call it study 1, it's the female group. There's no difference in between pre and post test. And in study 2, in the male group, we see some improvement because of some more training in that group. So what I wanted to look at in this table is just TEM. It's a typical error of measurement. So it's typical variation expressed in VO2 and power output for each threshold. And as you can see, for critical power, maximum lactate steady state, and RCP, that typical variation is quite close to the variation of our device. So it's around 100 milliliters per minute oxygen uptake. And in terms of watts, it's between 6 and 10 watts. So that's a typical variation you expect when you determine thresholds without manipulating any variable on different data. If you look at the local thresholds, you can see that the typical variation is already a bit higher, up to 200 milliliters per minute and 15 to 18 watts, which is already a bit higher. Okay, so that's the first finding. If you look at reproducibility of those thresholds, that the whole body threshold, so the first 3 seem to be more reproducible than the 2 at the right, the more local thresholds. If we look in the first group, we did not, you cannot see asterisks, so we did not find any significant differences, either if we express thresholds as their oxygen uptake, or if we express the thresholds as their associated power outputs. In the first group, in the female group, we did not find significant differences between the thresholds. If we look at the second group, those differences were the magnitude or the size between the thresholds of the difference was a bit higher, and statistically we can see some differences. And the question here is how physiologically relevant are these differences, but okay, it's statistically different. But then interesting, if we look at the correlations between all those thresholds, they're all highly correlated. So on the left, thresholds expressed in oxygen uptake, on the right in power output at time point 1 and 2, so pre and post. And they're all highly correlated, which is quite obvious. But if we look at correlations between the changes in the thresholds, so if we look at the difference, the change, how the thresholds evolve over time, we can see only few correlations. And to make it a bit more visual, this is how in the male group, the 11 subjects, how the thresholds evolved over time. And just to take out 2, if we look at subject 2 and 3, in subject 3, we can see that all thresholds evolve really simultaneously or in a similar way, while in subject 2, we can see that 2 thresholds increase pre-post and the other 2 remain the same. So this can question again, first, the equivalence of the concepts, and 2, the interchangeable use. So as a main conclusion of this study, but also of the work that we've done, or the studies that I performed before this longitudinal study, this is kind of the framework that we see if we use whole body thresholds, so being critical power, maximal lactate state, and RCP. I think that the typical variation is quite okay, if at least if you have a careful determination of those thresholds. We can see in the local thresholds that zone of variation is much more bigger. So the message here is that if you use those thresholds in research or practice, you should always account for what we call a certain gray zone of typical variation, and also the methodological factor that can influence those thresholds, which are listed on the left. Okay, so that's about the first part on thresholds. But I should move on to part 2, which is maybe a bit more interesting for the data scientists among the audience. Modeling of the W prime recovery. I picked out 2 studies that we performed on W prime recovery. Of course, if you think back to the formula I presented, the ski-ball model, W balance model, the prediction of W prime was dependent on recovery duration, just exponential pattern, and recovery power output, which is incorporated in that DCP, as you remember. Of course, when we came across this model first, one of the first things we were wondering is, in that model, it doesn't matter then what you did before. So there's no work characteristics incorporated in the model. While maybe it seems obvious that if you cycle 4 minutes at high intensity before you recover, or you cycle 8 minutes at a different intensity before you recover, it might have an impact on the speed you can recover. So question here is, are the work and recovery modalities properly accounted for in such a model? And also in those models now, there are no individual factors or characteristics incorporated. So that's also something that could be interesting to look at, because everyone's different, everyone has a different physiology. So if you want to model recovery, that's something important to account for. So in the first study we performed, we wanted to take a look at the effect of different work and recovery modalities on W prime recovery. And we also wanted to check if the W prime model, which was developed by using short intervals, if it would also work if we would apply it to a different type of protocol. And the protocol that we used was the one you can see on my screen now. We recruited participants and they did a first work bout, so WB1, until exhaustion. And either they performed that work bout at what we call P4 or P8. And P4, it's the power output that we calculated based on the critical power and W prime that in theory would elicit exhaustion within 4 minutes. And the same accounts for P8. So they cycled at P4 or P8 until exhaustion. And then immediately after, we gave them a recovery bout. And the recovery bout was 2 minutes, 4 minutes, or 6 minutes. And the recovery intensity was set at either 33 or 66% of critical power. And immediately following that recovery, they performed exactly the same work bout again. So if they did a P4 in work bout 1, they performed a P4 in work bout 2 as well. So they had to die 2 times. That's correct. So it's quite hard for those subjects. Also, if you count all the conditions, we have 2 work conditions, 2 recovery intensity conditions, and 3 recovery durations. So that's a total of 12 experimental conditions. So it's quite hard testing for those people. But how did we calculate W prime recovery? Just by using the time until exhaustion. So, for example, if someone cycles 4 minutes until exhaustion at the first work bout and they cycle 3 minutes at the second one, that's assumed to be 75% of W prime recovery. That's how we set up our protocol in this study. Let's show you the results. So you can see W prime recovery against recovery duration. And what we see is that if you look at the dotted lines, you can see the W prime recovery as predicted by the schema model. And especially at short durations, we saw that our participants recovered considerably faster. So that was the first observation. The second observation, and I go back first, second observation is that the work modality, so if they cycled at P4 or P8, you can see that it had also an impact on the W prime recovery. And just to put it in some numbers, we saw 13% difference between 6 and 2 minutes recovery. We saw 10% difference between 33, 66% recovery. And we saw 11% difference between P4 and P8. So, of course, depending on the modalities of the work bout preceding recovery can equally impact, or to the same extent impact, your W prime recovery. And if we put it in a correlation, we can see that the longer the work bouts that you do before you recover, the slower the time constant becomes. So it seems that going until exhaustion at a higher intensity in a shorter period of time is less fatiguing than when you cycle at a somewhat lower intensity over a longer period in time until exhaustion. So there's an effect of W prime depletion rate on the W prime recovery. We had only 3 time points in that study, so it was not possible for us to do like a formal kinetic characterization of that W prime reconstitution following exhaustion. So that's why we decided to set up a new study, another study, follow-up study, in which we included more time points, more recovery durations, and we wanted to do a formal kinetic modeling of the W prime following exhaustion. And in this study, we also included some individual factors. Protocol is exactly the same. Shouldn't explain it again. As you can see here, we only had 1 work modality, so P4 until exhaustion, and we had 8 recovery durations. So we had 30 seconds, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, and 15 minutes, and then they did the work bout again. The black dots represent the mean W prime recovery at each of those time points. And then what we did is we applied a mono-exponential fit to those points, once with an amplitude fixed at 100% and once with a free amplitude. So that's the gray and the black line. What you can see, and the other dotted lines, they represent exponential fits with just random time constants. But what you can see is that there is no single exponential model that really fits all those points well. Either they fit well in the beginning at the short durations, or they fit better at the longer durations. But you can see that the fitting of a simple exponential function to our model, to our points or data points, was not really good. And the problem was that in the beginning, recovery was quite high. As you can see, only after 30 seconds of recovery, so following a P4 until exhaustion, after 30 seconds of recovery, the mean or the average recovery, W prime recovery, was 30%. You can see, of course, there's quite some variation. So all those gray dots are the individual time points. So you can see some of them only recovered 15%, but we even had a subject that was able to recover almost half of its performance capacity after 30 seconds. But still 30% after 30 seconds, it's quite impressive, I think. But because of that high initial recovery, a simple exponential fit cannot capture that. So what we did is we applied a B exponential model where we have 2 phases, 2 time constants. And there you can see we got a much better fit. If we look at the individual factors, we found a correlation between W prime recovery and VO2 max, which we just took as a general parameter for physical fitness, cardiorespiratory fitness. We also took muscle biopsies in that study. We did not find a correlation there, not because I don't believe there's a correlation, but I think it's more methodologically that we didn't find it because of amount of muscle fibers and so on. We'll not go deeper into that, but I think it's already nice that we found a correlation between the VO2 max and W prime recovery in that study. And if we put that in a statistical model, we could see that I showed you the variation in W prime recovery between participants. VO2 max could explain quite some of that variation. If you have an athlete with a hypothetical VO2 max of 45, 55, and 65, you can see that there's quite some difference in the predicted W prime recovery already. So this is just a summary of if you look at the graph, the left top, it's the study I just presented you. Same for the study at the right top, and then the study on the right bottom. It's from another study we did on the recovery intensity. In that study, we tried to see if the use of DCP in absolute terms is the best way to model W prime recovery. But that's a study I will not go into detail on. So based on our findings, the studies that we did, or the studies I presented you, there are three main concerns, being that we see that if you use our modalities, and at least if you start from exhaustion, W prime reconstitution is underestimated at short recovery times. Work and recovery modalities are not really sufficiently accounting for, so work modalities should be incorporated in such models, and also the recovery modalities should be improved. And as a third point, it's really important to include individual characteristics of an athlete in W prime modeling. I think if we can improve those three concerns or issues, it would already take us a big step further in the right direction. Just to end my presentation, what we did or what we're doing at this point is, if we combine all the study data we've collected in the past 5 to 6 years, we have a database of over 600-700 unique tests in which we quantified W prime recovery in response to a specific combination of work and recovery modalities. And I did not present you that data today, but we also performed studies in which we partially depleted participants. But of course, because of course we always deplete participants until zero, but in real sports situations that rarely happens. Only if you have to cross the finish, that's the goal. So we also have data when W prime is partially depleted. We combined all that data, and we hired a data scientist, because I'm the exercise physiologist. And the data scientist, we asked him, okay, can you check which parameters or which modalities and individual factors exerted the greatest impact on W prime recovery. And if you look at the formulas on top, you can see CP divided by M, by mass. So it's CP relative to body weight. Seems like an important individual factor, which makes sense. You can see delta CP divided by CP. That's actually the DCP, but not expressed in absolute terms, but in relative terms. So instead of saying I'm cycling 100 watts below my CP, you express it in a relative way. For example, 70% below CP, because that already accounts a bit of the variation that exists between individuals with differing fitness levels. Interval duration is incorporated in that formula. It means that the length of the work bouts, your high intensity bouts that you're performing, has an effect on W prime recovery as well. And it seems a bit remarkable that at the end, the T rec is the time of the recovery, is also in the formula of that time constant, but that makes that the time constant becomes a variable parameter, meaning that the time constant slows down the further you are in the recovery, and that helps us to get an initial fast phase in W prime recovery, and then get a second slow phase. So this is just to show you some of the formulas that came out of our modeling. What we're if we combine that, if we applied, for example, the schema model to our data sets, what we found was like a structural underprediction of on average 20%. And of course, we used our data to make a new formula, so it makes sense that our formula has a better prediction error. But what we're trying now is to implement that new formula into practice as well. Just to show you this, because we know exactly what parameters are in our model, it's also interesting to look at the effect of changing one parameter on the total W prime recovery. So for example, here you can see W prime recovery for people with different critical power values. So you can see if you keep everything the same, all the modalities in the exercise the same, but for example, you increase the critical power per kilogram body weight with 1, you can see the effect that you can expect on W prime recovery. So those are the things that we're working on these days. If we think about, that's almost because I'm going a bit out of time, but I'm there. If we think about the applications of such modeling, and that's what we're exploring right now, is I think track cycling is a really good starting point, because in track cycling, for example, if you think about the team pursuit, you have really standardized conditions. We also have a system installed in Ghent at our track where we can get live data capturing. And this is, for example, this is an example. If you have power data during a team pursuit, because there's continuously a shift in who's in front, and also the time of that team pursuit is limited until, let's say, 4 minutes. It's really a nice first discipline to explore how such W prime models work, because of course, if you translate it more to road cycling, you have a lot more factors that can influence critical power W prime. Okay, I will sum up with this, so we can have some discussion or some questions. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thanks very much, Evan. And yeah, so we'll open it up to the audience for questions. So please just unmute your microphone and go ahead. See, Normand is first in line.
Thank you so much for taking your Friday night to talk to the amateurs out there. Appreciate it. My question relates to, you kind of just briefly covered it in your last slide. So I was just, what's your opinion on applying certain models to certain populations? Like I think it's James Bartram in Australia is doing some modeling with track cyclists, whereas I think the schema model was more developed in just recreationally trained individuals.
Yeah.
So just want to get your opinion on using certain watt prime recovery models for certain populations.
Yeah, yeah, it's a good question. Because indeed, the experiments that or the studies I presented you today are also performed on just recreational athletes or even physical education students. So that's what we always see as the normal, healthy, untrained or not cycle trained population. So indeed, you can question, now we've built a model and now we have to translate it to elite track cyclists. Can that work? But I think there are we should make a distinction between two things. First of all, I think if we make a model, we should make sure that the model accounts well for just the general modalities of the exercise. And for example, including the work modalities, as I showed you, what the athlete does during the intervals. Is he depleting 75%? Is he cycling at really high power outputs? Is he cycling 1 minute or 4 minutes? That's something until now that was not incorporated in models. So that's has nothing to do with the athlete. It has to do with the modality of the exercise that you're performing. And that's the same with the exponential kinetics. We should be sure how the pattern of W prime recovery in humans occurs. So once we have a model that works for those general modalities, then we can start fine-tuning. So what we will do now is we will apply, or we will test the model in the elite track cyclists. And of course, we have their values, critical power W prime. And of course, they will recover even much faster than the data we have now, but then we can adjust that model individually to those athletes as well. So I don't think it's really a problem to translate the model if your model basis is solid. If you know what I mean. I'm not sure if I explain it completely clear.
I think it makes sense that it might be more me.
For example, if you, because you refer to the research of Jason Bartram, what they did is they proposed an alternative formula to quantify the tau, the time constant. But of course, you still end up with a model that assumes just an exponential recovery that is equal in all athletes, because it's just dependent on what you put in the tau parameter. So in that model, the model is still not accounting for what the athlete does before, is still not accounting for, let's say, the VO2 max, the relative critical power of the athletes. So that's a bit what I mean. Of course, it's an improvement because your model fits better to the data of the elites, but I think there's still improvement to account better for just the general modalities of the exercise.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Hey, anyone else? Maybe I'll ask them. Talk about the definitions of critical power as a metabolic rate and as W prime as a energy, but in reality, critical power is a mechanical power, and W prime is mechanical work. Why do you define those in sort of metabolic energetic terms rather than mechanical terms?
Yeah, that's a very good question as well. I think if we start with critical power, for example, indeed it's critical power, it's a power output, but of course there is some, I don't know who published it, but there is data that shows, for example, if you produce if you cycle at critical power, for example, or you cycle at different pedal frequencies, that the critical power actually is, if you express this, or should be expressed as the VO2 oxygen uptake, it's that the threshold is actually the metabolic rate, which can be reflected by the oxygen uptake. So the power output changes, but the VO2 remains stable. So that's why they define it sometimes, or it's, I don't know, I never use it in practice as well, of course, because if you use critical power in practice, you cannot say, okay, you cycle at 3.5 liters today. So still it's a power output. But from a metabolic point of view, critical power has been defined as being the metabolic rate, because it can change depending on the conditions that you determine it.
Yeah, I guess like for me, I like thinking of, I mean, I can kind of get it why, it's associated as a metabolic rate. But I think that, because when you think about it as a mechanical sense, and, there is a metabolic rate, but there's the efficiency term, right? And efficiency varies. And one thing, when we talk about W prime, and in your definitions, kind of focus on energy supply, but really the ability to recruit muscle and produce power depends on, in part on the metabolites that are now blocking, the products of W prime breakdown, for example. So inorganic phosphate and other in protons, actually blocking the force producing mechanism. So you get this loss of efficiency. And yeah, I'm just kind of curious, like, I don't know, I think, because like even in your new model, right, your new model is still phenomenological sense, right? Like you're got the parameters of the task demand and then characteristics of the athlete, but we're still struggling with the mechanism. And like, if our models are have more mechanistic features in them, then it's possible to equally get a same, I think, output as your models, but now maybe closer to the reason why get them. Do you have any, like, are you guys looking at more mechanistically, like how determinants of CP and W prime and how their interplay affects this dynamic recovery and intermittent exercise?
That's something, and that's something I it's kind of difficult, and I've thought a lot of it. But for example, of course, actually you should see, or in my opinion, you can never see W prime just as a separate parameter loose from the exercise that you're doing. For example, what we saw in the study that we did until exhaustion, part of the W prime recovery that we quantify, just because of the specificity of the protocol that we're using, could actually be explained by a lower oxygen deficit, for example, by a shift in energy contribution. So because we start our first test from 50 watts, they go to target power output, so they have quite some deficit because actually they didn't do a real warm-up, while during the second bout, your energy contribution at the beginning of the exercise is already completely different. But of course, that's incorporated in your W prime quantification, which is just looking at time to exhaustion. So if I think about W prime or try to use it, I try always to see it as the net result of all processes in the body that contribute to the performance. I think it's really, and I don't think we will ever be able to do it, to just distract everything in or explain it into pieces what contributes to the W prime. And it's the interplay with the critical power and just with the exercise and the athlete, everything. So that's how I look at it. But indeed, it makes it more complex to have a real understanding about what's happening. Also, that's also why we try to explore the applicability of such W prime predictive models now in track cycling, because it's a bit standardized. We try to apply it to short duration exercise, because we also know if you extend it to exercise that's longer, you get fatigued. Also, critical power can decrease. You don't know. So the applicability of your model is getting worse and worse the longer you're exercising. So it's a model, but still, I think it can be used if you are aware of those limitations. I still strongly believe that it can be a useful tool for coaches in the field if you know your athletes well.
Yeah, I think that's that holds true. I mean, I think several people on this call have used the W prime balance model. I mean, what Phil and I, Phil has done a lot of work with athletes, and there's a lot of pessimism sometimes in the literature about the usefulness of, there's a lot of criticism about the critical power model and W prime balance models, but to suggest that they're not useful is silly, because they've really changed our thinking. And for me, like, I think these models are, for the scientists and the sports scientists and the coaches, are absolutely useful as conceptual tools foremost. Maybe they can't fit all the data under the situations that you want, but certainly thinking quantitatively about these things is much better than going on gut feel, as you had mentioned earlier. So no, I definitely agree with that. I mean, they're definitely useful. But yeah, I think so. And just to go back, I just wanted to explain what your point about the oxygen deficit. So in the studies where they have workbout 1 and workbout 2, VO2 kinetics takes time to establish itself, and as VO2 comes up, have to use these anaerobic energy sources to supply exercise. And when you only recover for short times, VO2 takes a while to come down. So the second workout, you're starting at a higher VO2, and therefore it's not quite the same situation. And so that's I was just trying to clarify your point about the W prime.
Yeah. So at the start of workbout 2, actually the aerobic contribution to the total energy is higher compared to workbout 1.
Yeah.
Which partially can explain why we get in absolute terms a bit higher as well. But maybe in the same context, I also, or in reality, also don't think that, because now we are talking about the modeling of the W prime recovery, so the exponential way, and we always assume that the depletion is linear.
Yeah.
Actually, think about it, doesn't make sense as well, because if you start from 0 and you start high intensity exercise, because of that deficit and the lack of your oxidative system, I think also there's more complex kinetics related to how W prime depletes. So that's another topic, of course. But
Hey, Norma, jump on.
I'm not too sure that's kind of what you were just talking about. So are you saying there's a relationship between the VO2 slow component and fast component and watt prime?
There's a relationship. There's for sure a relationship, has been shown in multiple studies, between the VO2 slow component and the W prime, because what W prime actually represents is, we call it the wideness of your intensity domain, of your severe intensity domain. So it means what is between your critical power and your VO2 max. So if that intensity domain or that range of intensities is higher, your W prime is higher as well, and the raise in your VO2 until VO2 max is higher as well. So there's a clear link between depletion of W prime and the development of VO2 kinetics. Yes.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Excellent. Is there any more questions from the audience? If not, I'm going to stop the recording shortly here. But before I do, I just want to thank Kevin very much again for an excellent talk, and thank you for entertaining all our questions and discussion afterwards. If you don't mind, if you want to hang out for a couple of minutes, just formally, if anyone has any, just want some formal discussion, that would be great. I wish, it was late in the day and after work, I'd crack a beer and cheers you from overseas, but that's not going to really work for me today, unfortunately, because I'm busy. But anyway, I hope you were able to enjoy your evening. And again, thanks so much for joining at this kind of odd hour for you. And that was really great.
Okay, it was my pleasure. Thank you very much.